Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history. Picking up where we left off last time, we will cover the second interbellum of the Crusadian period. Interbellum just means between the wars. So the second interbellum was between 1149 and 1188, meaning the time between the Second and the Third Crusade. The political, ethnic, and family rivalries that had caused so much fighting in European history were transported intact to Outremer, the kingdom over the sea, the kingdom of Jerusalem, by the Crusaders. This meant that after the failure of the Second Crusade, the Latin nobility in the Holy Land failed to formulate a coherent strategy for preserving the Christian kingdom. Some of them favored alliances with the Muslims. And as we saw, that there were even cases where Latin knights fought as mercenaries for Muslim emirs against other Muslim emirs. And then the reverse was also the case. There were times when Muslim warriors fought for Christian nobles against other Christian nobles. Whereas there were those who still more, who favored war to the death with the Muslims, by which they meant a military doctrine of continual expansion of the Latin kingdom through conquest. Still others, mostly those born in the Holy Land into European families, adopted a more fatalistic attitude. They sensed that the Christians were too outnumbered to remain forever. And perhaps even those who really thought about things and observed realized that it was only possible because the Muslims were so divided for reasons we covered last time. But they hoped, no doubt these Christians, the Pulanes as they call them, those born in Outremer, that it would last their time because they didn't have any place to go in Europe. To cement the hopelessness of this position, the military orders, which were the backbone of the realm, were constantly in competition with each other for new castles, new privileges. They were the best trained men militarily, but without unity, they could not even formulate, let alone carry out, a major military enterprise. This ambiguity and confusion in the Crusader kingdom was perceived by the more observant of the Muslims. Among them, there was one man who had no confusion in his mind and took advantage of this. He began life as a Kurdish mercenary, Muslim, religiously Sunni, who sold his skills, to the Seljuk Turks, and then from there rose, as we'll see. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. So Yusuf, well, anyway, I'll get to that. He's better known in Western chronicles as Saladin, S-A-L-A-D-I-N. He was not only a warrior, an accomplished warrior in battle, but he was one of those leaders. He had this, it's almost an indefinable quality that you can only perceive from the effect, is he had a comprehensive situational awareness that marks true leaders. Not only military, but all kinds of leaders. And so those who have it can be effective on the battlefield and off the battlefield, as he was. In addition, by all reports, Christian and Muslim, he was a man of high principles, understood within the cultural context of his time. Meaning, if he gave his word, he would keep it. Now, that word, that doesn't mean he was a pushover. That word might be to protect Christians and Jews from bandits. If he gave his word, he would do everything within his power to do so. On the other hand, if he promised to slaughter Christians and Jews who refused what he deemed fair terms of surrender, then he would do that too. So it doesn't mean he was a softy or a pushover or a nice guy, but at least you knew where you stood with him. And that's, frankly, more than you usually get in life, whether in the 12th century or the 21st. Okay, Saladin was born in what's now Tikrit, Iraq, in 1137, ethnically Kurdish, born into the tribe of Rawadiya, Rawadiya. He was brought up in the Sunni version of Islam. His actual name was Yusuf. His personal name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, son of Ayyub is the Arabic rendering of Job, the biblical character figure Job. So Joseph, son of Job. And later he earned his more famous name, the Salah ad-Din, means righteousness of the faith. He grew up fully bilingual in Kurdish and Arabic. He could both read and write. His father, Ayyub, was in service to Zengi, guy we already met. His actions precipitated the Second Crusade. After Zengi's death in 1146, Saladin's father, Ayyub, continued to serve Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din, N-U-R-A-D-D-I-N. And Ayyub's son, the young Saladin, did the same. Saladin first experienced combat in 1164 under the command of his uncle, his father's brother, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh ibn Shadi. So he's best conventionally in the accounts, he's known as Shirkuh, S-H-I-R-K-U-H. And that was an earned title. It meant Lion of the Mountain. So his actual name was Asad. It was Asad, the son of Shadi, but he's better known as Shirkuh. Not Shirkuh, that's the Kurdish word, meaning lion of the mountain. A disputed succession among the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt presented Nur ad-Din, Saladin's master at that point, an opportunity to expand his power. So he dispatched Shirkuh, Saladin's uncle, to invade Egypt and support the weaker of the candidates in the succession dispute, whose name was Shawar. Because then, you know, if because of their intervention Shawar became the Fatimid Sultan, then they would be dependent on, on Nur ad-Din for support. So that was the logic there. Saladin, age 26, was part of his uncle's army, which turned out to be a victorious army, that succeeded in installing Shawar as a puppet. Now, I mean, it's just a puppet for Nur ad-Din. Unexpectedly, this expedition brought Saladin his first combat experience against Latin knights of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. They also, the Latins in Jerusalem, also perceived opportunity in the succession struggle in Egypt and sent troops with the goal of annexing Egypt to the Latin kingdom. The king at the time was Baldwin III. He was king from 1143 to 1163, and we met him during the Second Crusade. He died childless on February 10th, 1163. So he was followed by his younger brother, Amalric, A-M-A-L-R-I-C, Amalric I, who could not pass up a chance of securing his southwest flank by adding Egypt to his realm. Shirkuh engaged the Latins west of Giza, Egypt, at the Battle of Bilbais. That's B-A-L-B-E-I-S, with Saladin commanding the right flank. The fighting was going against the Muslims in this battle, as the armor of the Latin knights, as well as their larger horses, gave them the advantage of striking power, as well as insulation from Muslim weapons. As many of the arrows, like if there were bronze tip arrows, then they would just bounce off, But in the course of the battle, Saladin noticed their one weakness of the Latin knights, and that was their weight. is of all the armor. And both their horses and the men were armored, so that's weight. So he feigned a retreat, luring the Latin knights into dividing their forces. As one contingent pursued him into a ravine where the sand was too deep and loose for their horses to maneuver, turning the advantage to Saladin's men as they were mounted on camels. You know, and the foot of the camel, the way it's shaped, it evolved to function on sand. Saladin captured the Christian leader, Sir Hugh of Caesarea, whose horse had sunk in the sand up to its saddle. And, you know, so he was just trapped. And the battle was therefore a Muslim victory. The capture actually saved Sir Hugh's life, because there was no way he could get out. Even if he could climb off of his horse, he was weighed down by his armor, so he would have sunk in the sand too. And, to his surprise, to Sir Hugh's surprise, Saladin treated him as an honored guest, rather than a tortured prisoner of war, until he was ransomed. So again, you know, Saladin, it's within the context of his time. So, you know, capturing a nobleman within the context of the time, you know, that meant, you know, you could hold him for ransom. And the Christians did the same if they captured an important Muslim. So that practice is odious to us. I mean, kidnapping is, but within the context of the time, you know, Saladin did treat him honorably. You know, he wasn't chained up or tortured. This exploit, the whole battle and everything, vaulted Saladin to the status of a respected military commander, a man of honor, again within the context of the time, a reputation which he built on and enhanced throughout his life. Uncle Shirkuh then entrusted Saladin with command of the garrison defending the wealthy port city of Alexandria, Egypt. In 1169, Uncle Shirkuh was assassinated by the Fatimid Caliph Shawar, whom Shirkuh and Saladin put in power at the behest of their emir, their lord. Nur-ad-Din was a Turk, so he wouldn't have used the term emir. It was an Atabeg. Atabeg was his title. But Shawar was tired of being a puppet, so he had Shirkuh assassinated, hoping to get control of Egypt back for himself instead of just being a puppet. Saladin avenged his uncle by personally killing Shirkuh, and so made himself vizier of Egypt. And notice, vizier is it's a high-ranking title, but it's not the highest title. So Saladin was still in service to Nur-ad-Din, as was Saladin's father. So Saladin did not at this point claim for himself the title of sultan or caliph or emir, but just vizier, meaning that he was the servant of Nur-ad-Din. A complication for Saladin was his ethnicity, Kurdish, as well as his religion, which was Sunni Muslim. The Fatimids in Egypt were ethnically Arab and Berber. Religiously, they were Shiite. So a hit team was purchased to murder him, and they ambushed, but he killed them himself. He was a skilled warrior, not just a general. And then this was followed by, because the plan was they would kill him, and then they had an army too. So then once the head was cut off, they figured with Shirkuh dead, and Saladin still young, that then if an army rose up, that he would be overwhelmed, and then they would be able to drive him out. But Saladin killed the hit team himself, and so he was there to lead his own troops against the uprising of the Fatimids. But once more, he prevailed in battle. He just outgeneraled them. So he secured his control over the survivors in 1170, still serving the Zengid dynasty of Nur-ad-Din. On the 31st of July, 1173, Saladin's father, Ayub, was wounded. And this wound, he ultimately died. It got infected. He died on August 9th of the same year, 1173. The following year, May 15th, 1174, Nur-ad-Din died after falling ill the previous week. So this Saladin, this was a major change for him. So he lost his uncle already, and he grieved that, he avenged that. But then, within a year, he loses his father as well as his overlord. So this, so he then underwent an internal change, feeling freed from the obligations of his past, and he had a devoted following, who had personal loyalty to him. From this point, Saladin then began building an empire for himself, and he created the Ayyubid dynasty, named for his father, with Egypt as his base. By November 23rd of 1174, he secured control of Damascus in Syria, with no fight needed, as Nur ad-Din had been in charge of Damascus. And Nur ad-Din, his only heir, was an 11-year-old son, but that son, an heir, had been kidnapped and removed by Turkish rivals of Nur ad-Din. So then Saladin goes and he just takes over Damascus. So he has Egypt. Well, actually, it's easier just to see it on the map. This map's better. Yeah. So he has, let's see, I gotta see what I'm doing. I have the camera minimized here. Okay. So Saladin Egypt is what he takes over. So then you have the Holy Land up here. Then you have Syria, and here's Damascus. So he has Egypt, and he has Damascus. And the Holy Land is in between. So, you see where this is going, leading up to the Third Crusade. All right. On May 11th, 1175, another hit team, this time bigger, 13 assassins, infiltrated Saladin's camp. He and his men were able to contain them, but they fought to the death. So, Saladin had no means of ascertaining who employed them. Was it the Turkish rivals of Nur ad-Din who kidnapped Nur ad-Din's son? Or was it Arab, Fatimid? Well, they were gone, but I mean Arabs in Egypt who wanted to take over for themselves and resented this Kurdish Sunni. Understanding that some would never accept him because of his ethnicity, his religion, or his former status. He wasn't a slave, but he was, the son of an ordinary soldier. Perceiving all of that, understanding that none of that could be changed, Saladin decided that the path, the strategy, would be to unite all of the Islamic factions on the basis of something they shared. Like they would never get over, like the Shiites would never get over that he was Sunni. The Arabs would never get over that he was Kurdish. But what they could all share was the ideal of jihad, of holy war, against the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. This led to the Third Crusade. The king of Jerusalem who Saladin faced was Amalric I. He died on July 11th, 1174, so followed by his son Baudouin IV, or Baldwin IV. Baldwin is the leper king, and that's not he actually did have leper. He had the Hansen's disease, and they're actually, but his name of his biography is the leper king. Baudouin IV contracted leprosy at an early age. Actually, the annalist, the chronicler we met, William of Tyre, and we'll do some more quotes from him in due course. William of Tyre actually noticed when Baudouin and other kids were playing that they were playing soldier, as kids do, and Baudouin got a cut on his arm, but didn't even notice it. And so at first, William thought, okay, well, maybe he's just trying to be tough. But then he asked, said, you need to get that looked at. And Baudouin was surprised. So then that led to eventually the diagnosis of leprosy. When Baudouin, the leper king, died on March 16th, 1185. He was followed as king by his 5-year-old nephew, Baudouin V. Baudouin V was sickly. Now, it's possible he also had leprosy, but that isn't as well established because he died 5 months later, in August of 1186. He was followed as ruler by his mother, Sibylla. She was the sister of the leper king, Baudouin IV, and she was married, so her husband would be the king consort. And this was, it's spelled Guy, G-U-Y, but since he was French, it was pronounced Guy. So Guy of Lusignan, Lusignan. So Baudouin V was followed by Sibylla, his mother, who actually had the lineage, but then the king consort, Guy of Lusignan. These two were ridiculously incompetent, and that gave Saladin his opportunity to return the Holy Land to Islamic control. Saladin lured them into committing the bulk of their army to a battle. He engaged them at Hattim, Hattim, on the 4th of July, 1187. And Saladin wiped out the Christian army. He attacked in the middle of a sandstorm. Well, when the wind was in his, like the wind was at his back and in the Crusaders' eyes. So that's how he was able to achieve such a victory. And it was both a tactical and strategic victory for Saladin. He captured the king consort, Guy. Sibylla was, of course, not at the battlefield, but once she heard about the defeat, she escaped to Tripoli, Lebanon, with her daughters. And we'll meet her again. She's not going to last much longer, but we'll meet her again. Okay, now we do have some accounts that we can read from to see how other people at the time understood their time, and also how they phrase things, how they express things. So this is a letter written by a hospitaller. Remember them, we met them, one of the military orders, but originally a medical order that later militarized. These are the ones that wore the black habit with the white cross. This is Brother Ansbert, A-N-S-B-E-R-T. He wrote to the master of the order in Italy, a report, making a report of what happened. And this is in 1187. The master he wrote to was Archambault, A-R-C-H-A-M-B-A-U-L-T. Brother Ansbert's words. We make known to you, Lord Archambault, master of the Hospitallers in Italy, and to all the brethren, all the events which have happened in the countries beyond the seas. So that's outre-mer, over the sea. Outre, it's the French word for over. Mer is the sea. So that's how it was the conventional way of referring to, instead of saying the Middle East like we say today, or others might call it the Levant for that region. Leve means so the land of the rising sun in the east. Another way they rephrase it is outre-mer, the land over the sea, beyond the sea, meaning the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, back to the quote. Learn, therefore, that the king of Jerusalem was near Sephora with a great army of at least 30,000 men about the festival of the apostles Peter and Paul, and was in perfect concord with the count of Tripoli, and the latter was with his army. And behold, Saladin, the pagan king. Now, again, I'm sorry, that's what he... Again, I said, that the church does not currently regard Muslims as pagans. So this is just the way Brother Ansbert is phrasing it. And behold, Saladin approached Tabaria, which is Lake Tiberias from the Sea of Galilee in the New Testament, with 80,000 horsemen, and took Tabaria. After this was done, the king of Jerusalem, which is Guy of Lusignan, left Sephora and went with his men drawn up against Saladin. And Saladin came against him near Mariscalia on the Friday after the festival of the apostles Peter and Paul. This is all around the Sea of Galilee. It's on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Battle was engaged, and during the whole day they fought fiercely. but night interrupted the strife. In the intervening night, the king of Jerusalem fixed his tents near Salnubia. On the next day, Saturday, moved with his army. About the third hour, the master of the Templars, with all his brethren, began the battle. They received no aid, and, by God's permission, lost the greater portion of their men. After this happened, the king, by hard fighting and with great difficulty, went with his army to Nain. Also in the Bible, you remember the widow of Nain, where Jesus raised the son from, about a league distant. And then the Count of Tripoli came with the king and made him pitch his tents near the mountain, which is a sort of fortress. And they were not able to pitch more than 3 tents. After this was done, the Turks, seeing that they had pitched their tents, kindled fires around the army of the king, and in truth, the heat was so great that the horsemen were baking, and were not able to eat or drink. Next, Baudouin of Fatinor, and Bakbabarak of Tabaria, and Lysius, with 3 other associates, separated themselves from the army, and went over to Saladin. And a thing which is grievous to relate, they denied their faith, surrendered themselves to him, and betrayed to him the army of the king of Jerusalem, by revealing the difficult position in which they were in. Therefore Saladin sent against Taki Adin, with 20,000 chosen soldiers, who rushed upon our army, and the battle raged fiercely, from the 9th hour to Vespers. Vespers is sunset. And because of our sins, very many of ours were killed. The Christian people were conquered. The king was captured. And the Holy Cross and Count Gabula and Mila, well, he lists a bunch of people who were killed or captured. Skipping down, not more than 200 horsemen and soldiers escaped for the Christians. The Count of Tripoli and Reginald, the Lord of Sidon, escaped. After this, Saladin collected his army again, and on Sunday came to Saphara, and took Saphara, and Nazareth, and Mount Tabor. And on Monday came to Acre, which is, it's a port on the coast, present-day Akko. Likewise, those of Caesarea, and Jaffa, and Neapolis, and when you just listed on it. I skipped that. And we fled with the galley to Laodicea, and we heard that Tyre had surrendered. Moreover, the following cities are still safe and awaiting aid from the Western Church, namely Jerusalem, Ascalon. He goes on and lists some names. Jerusalem is a significant one. Moreover, so great is the multitude of the Saracens and Turks. And that's a key thing. So previously we saw in the last episode, in the last session, that the Turks, Turkish Muslims, and Arab Muslims were antagonistic, were fighting with each other. So now Saladin is, at least he's able to unite them. So he has both Arab Muslims as well as Turkish Muslims in his army, which gives him the advantage of numbers, as well as not having to worry about securing his rear from attack. They cover the face of the earth as far as Jerusalem, like an innumerable army of ants, and unless aid is quickly brought to the remaining above-mentioned cities and to the few Christians remaining in the east, by a similar fortune they will be plundered by the raging infidels thirsting for the blood of the Christians. Okay, evidently Brother Ansbert did not survive, because no other accounts from him survive. But we do have another account. This is from the De Expugationi Terrae Sanctae per Saladinum. So the capture of the Holy Land by Saladin. This is an anonymous Latin account which covers the years 1186 to 1191. Okay, so here's an excerpt. The Battle of Hattin, which is the one that Brother Ansbert described, although he used different names, decimated the knights and soldiers of the Latin states. The remnants of the fighting forces of the kingdom sought refuge in the fortified coastal cities, and especially the city of Tyre. Lebanon. Through the months of July and August, Saladin successively occupied the remaining towns. Delivery. Oh, okay. Outside the remaining towns, cities, and castles of the Holy Land. His initial attack upon Tyre failed, however, and the city was bypassed. Late in September, Saladin's armies camped before the Holy City itself. The Holy City of Jerusalem was besieged on September 20th. It was surrounded on every side by unbelievers, who shot arrows everywhere into the air. They were accompanied by frightening armaments, and with a great clamor of trumpets, they shrieked and wailed. The city was aroused by the noise and tumult of the barbarians, and for a time they all cried out, "True and holy cross, sepulchre of Jesus Christ's resurrection, save the city of Jerusalem and its dwellers." The battle was then joined, and both sides began courageously to fight. But since so much unhappiness was produced through sorrow and sadness, we shall not enumerate all the Turkish attacks and assemblies, by which, for 2 weeks, the Christians were worn down. During this time, it seemed that God had charge over the city, for who can say why one man who was hit died, while another wounded man escaped? Arrows fell like raindrops, so that one could not show a finger above the ramparts without being hit. There were so many wounded that all the hospitals and physicians in the city were hard put to it just to extract the missiles from their bodies. I myself was wounded in the face by an arrow which struck the bridge of my nose. Now, we don't know who this guy is. It's an anonymous chronicle. But the copy of it was found in an English abbey, so it suggests he was an English knight. We don't know if he was in a military order or not. And the fact that he was wounded suggests that he was fighting rather than just being a monk, observer. Anyway, the wooden shaft had been taken out, but the metal tip has remained there to this day. The inhabitants of Jerusalem fought courageously enough for a week, while the enemy settled down opposite the Tower of David. Saladin saw that he was making no progress, and that as things were going, he could do no damage to the city. Accordingly, he and his aides began to circle around the city and to examine the city's weak points, in search of a place where he could set up his engines without fear of the Christians, and where he could more easily attack the town. And then whoever this guy is goes on and does a lot of more of the tactical explanations of the ditches and all the different things they did. So skipping down. At dawn, on September 26th, the king of Egypt, then he's referred to Saladin, even though Saladin did not use the Latin title Rex, but he was the ruler of Egypt, as we've seen. Ordered the camp to be moved without any tumult or commotion. He ordered the tents to be pitched in the Vale of Jehoshaphat on the Mount of Olives, and throughout the hills in that region. When morning had come, the men of Jerusalem lifted up their eyes, and when the darkness of the clouds had gone, they saw that the Saracens were pulling up their tents, as if they were going to leave. The inhabitants of Jerusalem rejoiced greatly and said, "The king of Syria has fled, because he could not destroy the city as he had planned." When the turn of the matter was known, however, this rejoicing was quickly turned into grief and lamentation. The tyrant Saladin at once ordered the engines to be constructed and ballistas to be put out. He likewise ordered olive branches and branches of other trees to be collected and piled between the city and the engines. That evening he ordered the army to take up arms and the engineers to proceed with their iron tools, so that before the Christians could do anything about it, they would all be prepared at the foot of the walls. This cruelest of tyrants also arrayed up to 10,000 armed knights with bows and lances on horseback, so that if the men of the city attempted a foray, they would be blocked. He stationed another 10,000 or more men, armed to the teeth, with bows for shooting arrows, under cover of shields and targets. He kept the rest with himself and his lieutenants around the engines. When everything was arranged in this fashion, at daybreak they began to break down the corner of the tower and to attack all around the walls. The archers began shooting arrows, and those who were at the engines began to fire rocks in earnest. The men of the city, expecting nothing of the sort, and left the city walls without guard. Tired and worn out, they slept until morning. For unless the Lord watch the city, he labors in vain who guards it. When the sun had risen, those who were sleeping in the towers were startled by the noise of the barbarians. When they saw these things, they were terrified and overcome with fear. Like madmen, they yelled out throughout the city, "Hurry, men of Jerusalem, hasten, help! The walls have already been breached. The foreigners are entering." Aroused, they hastened through the city as bravely as they could, but they were powerless to repulse the Damascenes from the walls, either with spears, lances, arrows, stones, or with molten lead and bronze. The Turks unceasingly hurled rocks forcefully against the ramparts. Between the walls and the outer defenses, they threw rocks and the so-called Greek fire, which burns wood, stone, and whatever it touches. Everywhere the archers shot arrows without measure and without ceasing, while the others were boldly smashing the walls. The men of Jerusalem, meanwhile, were taking counsel. They decided that everyone, with such horses and arms as could be mustered, should leave the city and march steadily through the gate which leads to Jehoshaphat. Thus, if God allowed it, they would push the enemy back from the walls. They were foiled, however, by the Turkish horsemen, and were woefully defeated. The Chaldeans, this is a Latin guy writing, so he's the Saladin and his army. Even though, as we've seen, the Chaldeans refers more properly to Iraq, and these were not Iraqis, but anyway. So the Chaldeans fought the battle fiercely for a few days and triumphed. The Christians were failing, so by this time that scarcely 20 or 30 men appeared to defend the city walls. No man could be found in the whole city who was brave enough to dare keep watch at the defenses for a night, even for a fee of 100 bezants. With my own ears I heard the voice of a public crier between the great wall and the outer works proclaim, on behalf of the Lord Patriarch and the other great men of the city, this is Patriarch Heraclius, that if 50 strong and brave men could be found who would take up arms voluntarily and keep guard during the night over the corner which had already been destroyed, they would receive 5,000 bezants. That's gold coins. But they were not found. Meanwhile, they sent legates to the king of Syria, begging him to temper his anger toward them and accept them as allies, as he had done with others. He refused, and is reported to have given this reply: "I have frequently heard from our wise men, the Faqih, that Jerusalem cannot be cleansed, saved by Christian blood, and I wish to take counsel with them on this point." Thus uncertain, they returned. They sent others, Balian and Renier of Naples, and Thomas Patrick, offering 100,000 bezants. Saladin would not receive them, and their hopes were shattered. They returned. They sent them back again with others, demanding that Saladin himself say what kind of agreement he wanted. If possible, they would comply. If not, they would hold out to the death. Saladin had taken counsel and laid down these ransom terms for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Each male, 10 years old or older, was to pay 10 bezants for his ransom. Females, 5 bezants. Boys, 7 years old and under, 1 bezant. Those who wished would be freed on these terms and could leave securely with their possessions. The inhabitants of Jerusalem who would not accept these terms, or those who did not have 10 bezants, were to become loot, spoils of war, to be slain by the army's swords. This agreement pleased the Lord Patriarch and the others who had money. On Friday, October 2nd, this agreement was read throughout the streets of Jerusalem, so that everyone might, within 40 days, provide for himself and pay to Saladin the tribute as aforesaid for his freedom. When they heard these arrangements, the crowds throughout the city wailed in sorrowful tones, "Woe, woe to us, miserable people! We have no gold. What are we to do?" Who would have ever thought that such wickedness would be perpetrated by Christians? But, alas, by the hands of wicked Christians, Jerusalem turned over to the wicked. The gates were closed, guards were posted. The Faqihs and Qadis, that's the wise men and the judges, who are considered bishops and priests by the Saracens. That's not exactly true, but that, again, this is a medieval Latin guy, so he's using terms he would understand. But the reason I say that is that the Muslims, none of the versions of Islam really have a theology of sacraments the way we do. Certainly not the sacrament of holy orders. So they're the faqih. These are the wise. They do have wisdom figures. They have teachers. They have imams who lead prayer, but they're not ordained the way that we think of as in the West. But certainly, to call them religious leaders is fair. Came for prayer and religious purposes first to the temple of the Lord, and in which they have great faith for salvation. They believed they were cleansing it, and with unclean and horrible bellows they defile the temple by shouting with polluted lips the Muslim precept, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, God is great. Our people held the city of Jerusalem for some 89 years. Within a short time, Saladin had conquered almost the whole kingdom of Jerusalem. He exalted the grandeur of Muhammad's law and showed that in the event it might exceed that of the Christian religion. Okay, so on October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin. And as we saw the terms, we already read the terms. But he also, one thing that this chronicler left out, is Saladin did offer that Christians who could pay the ransom and wanted to remain in the Holy Land, that they could, but they would have to live under the conditions of the original Muslim conquest, which is that they could practice their faith modestly, meaning behind closed doors, in exchange for paying for an extra tax, I forgot the name. I have it in the earlier section on Islam. And 14,000 Christians chose to do that, to stay in the Holy Land. The Crusader kingdom would survive for another 104 years until 1291. And they would still call it the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the accounts. But then it never, the base really shifted to different cities. Acre would really be, and Acre would be the last of the Crusader cities to fall in 1291. Okay, in the year that happened, the Pope was Pope 173, Gregory VIII. He reigned for only 2 months. He died on December 17th, 1187. He was followed as Pope 174 by the Cardinal Bishop of Palestrina, Paolo Scolari, who took the papal name Clement III and reigned from 1187 to March of 1191. During his reign, let's see, in 1190, we re-encounter Jewish Aristotelianism in Andalusia, in Muslim Spain. A guy we've met already. We introduced him earlier in his career, Rabbi Moses ben Maimonides. He was born into the minority Jewish population of Islamic Andalusia, meaning the Muslim part of Spain. Maimonides studied medicine, which brought him into contact with the Aristotelian philosophy of Avicenna and Averroes. Avicenna being a Persian Muslim and Averroes being a Sunni Muslim in Spain. One of the periodic and recurring episodes of homicidal anti-Semitism occurred in 1149. Maimonides survived, but he did the math, and decided that relocating his family to North Africa would be prudent. He did so, and he became a personal physician to Saladin and Saladin's son, who, like him, were outsiders. Remember, even though they were Muslim, they were ethnically Kurdish, not Arab. This position freed Maimonides to focus on his philosophy and to develop a synthesis of faith and reason using Aristotle's logic and metaphysics in a work that he published in 1190, which is why I'm mentioning this now, titled Guide for the Perplexed. And this, as well as other works, would be copied and in due course make their way into the West. In the same year, 1190, at Acre in the Holy Land, another military religious order was established called the Teutonic Knights. Let's see. Anyway, and I'm gonna talk about them later. So we'll stick with the Jerusalem and the aftermath leading to the Third Crusade. So the shock of losing Jerusalem, as well as the bulk of the Christian army at the Battle of Hattin, prompted an outpouring of emotion in Europe. On October 29th, 1187, Pope Gregory VIII appealed for another crusade. Now, this was after the Battle of Hattin, but before news of Saladin's capture of Jerusalem had reached the West. The Pope also ordered for all the faithful a general abstinence from meat on Fridays for a 5-year period, in atonement for the sins which had brought about the recent disasters in the East. In January of 1188, the French king Philip II and the English king Henry II met at Gisors to discuss the situation. An agreement was reached which obliged the monarchs with their respective armies to proceed to the Holy Land together. Peace between England and France was never easy and certainly was never long-lasting. Before the year was out, a war erupted between them. And then, in July of 1189, while that war was in progress, Henry II of England died. He was followed by his son, Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart. That greatly improved the prospects for the English going on crusade, because Richard loved to fight. And he was a genuinely talented general, and he really did want to go on crusade. So another meeting took place between Philip II, who was still the King of France, and Richard, now the new King of France. And a new agreement was reached for the Third Crusade. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, whom we've already met, at some times aligned with, but more often than not aligned against, the Church. This is Frederick I Barbarossa, the Redbeard. He decided to go on his own on crusade, regardless of what the English and French did. So he departed with the German army in May of 1189. Barbarossa's force was large, it was well equipped. So the army set out to follow the land route through the Balkans and Asia Minor to the Holy Land. And in Asia Minor, the Germans were harried from time to time by Turkish soldiers, but only one pitched battle took place at Kona on May 17th, 1190. Barbarossa's men, the Germans, proved victorious, and so his army was able to pass through the Taurus Mountains. Then, history changed before Barbarossa was able to reach the Holy Land. And here again we have an account. This is it's an anonymous Latin account, but from a different person than the last one we read. This is the story of the Historia, the expedition of the Emperor Frederick. Quote, on the 10th of June, this is the year 1190, the advance unit of the army, German army, camped on the plains of Seleucia. Up to this point, the whole army of the cross, the rich and the poor, the sick and those who seemed healthy, had journeyed through the glare of the sun and the burning heat of summer along a tortuous road which led them across rocky cliffs, accessible only to birds and mountain goats. The emperor, who had shared in all the dangers, wished both to moderate the inordinate heat and to avoid climbing the mountain peak. Accordingly, he attempted to swim across the very swift Callicadnus River. As the wise man says, however, thou shalt not swim against the river's current. Wise though he was in other ways, the emperor foolishly tried his strength against the current and the power of the river. Although everyone tried to stop him, he entered the water and plunged into a whirlpool. He, who had often escaped great dangers, perished miserably. Let us comment on the secret judgment of God, to whom no man dare say, "Why have you acted thus?" when he takes such or so many men in death. The emperor was indeed a knight of Christ and a member of his army. He was taken up while on a laudable mission to recover the Lord's land and his cross. And thus, even though he was taken unexpectedly, we may believe that without doubt he be saved. When, therefore, the other nobles around him hastened, although too late, to help him, they took him from the water and dragged him to the bank. Everyone was afflicted with great sorrow over his death, so much so indeed that some, caught between hope and dread, would have ended their lives with him. Others, however, despaired, and it seemed that God did not care for them. They renounced the Christian faith to become pagans among the heathen. Mourning and unrestrained sorrow, not unmerited by the death of such a prince, occupied the hearts of all, so that they could rightly lament, saying with the prophet, "Alas, we are sinners. The wreath has faded from our brows. There are sad hearts everywhere." The army then divided. Some made their way to Tripoli, Lebanon, which was in Christian hands. The others, who followed the Duke of Swabia, marched towards Antioch in Syria. On June 17th, they came to Port St. Simeon. On June 19th, they came to Antioch, where the messengers of the Lord, Leo of the Mountain, had come to meet the Lord Emperor. The messengers had as yet heard nothing of the emperor's death. Learning of it, they were afflicted more than the others. In Antioch, the emperor was given a royal burial, as was fitting, to the accompaniment of disconsolate mourning. They laid the remains of his body to rest in the cathedral church of Peter, Prince of the Apostles. Okay, so this happened in Mersin province in southern Turkey. Okay. All right, so the names have all changed, but so see, let's do this again. All right, see Antalya on the map. So it was just further than that where they were going. So they had marched all the way through, we're going here and across the Taurus Mountains down to the coast, and so then Antalya, there it is, yeah, Antalya. Then they had passed, and so this is in the Mersin province of Turkey, and this is the same province where Cilicia, the remains of ancient Cilicia are, where St. Paul, where Tarsus is, where St. Paul grew up. The Duke of Swabia that the anonymous chronicler referred to was Frederick VI, the Duke of Swabia. He carried on with the remnants of the German army, along with some Hungarians, and he was Duke of Swabia from this point until he died. He did go to the Holy Land, and he died at the siege of Acre in 1191. The death of the German Emperor Barbarossa drastically reduced the military effectiveness of the Third Crusade, because after his burial in Antioch, as we saw, read from the account, when he died, some just left, they just deserted. But even of those who continued, once he was buried in Antioch, many just returned back to Europe. And so there was fewer numbers, and those who remained were smaller and therefore a better target. So many of those who remained were killed by the Muslims, or if they stayed, were just killed in the fighting alongside the other crusaders. Still, the French and the English monarchs, Philip II and Richard the Lionheart, respectively, continued their preparations. But these preparations were not complete until July of 1190, when they met at Vézelay, France, to set out jointly on crusade. On the way, they became distracted in Italy and embroiled in fighting during a successions dispute in Sicily, which had nothing to do with the Crusade, but did involve dynastic politics in the person of Richard's sister. So we visited Naples, Sicily many times, with the Normans there, the House of de Hauteville. In 1176, William II, King of Sicily, de Hauteville, whom we previously met, he sent ambassadors to England looking for a princess to marry. Himself. He was 23 at the time. The ambassadors were presented with the seventh child of Henry II, the 11-year-old Princess Joan, the House of Plantagenet. Now remember, this also is part of the feudalism problem. So just as the feudalism problem eroded the sacrament of holy orders, in ways like this, it also eroded the sacrament of matrimony. This is not a basis for the sacrament of matrimony. So this was an abuse of the sacrament, just as the aristocracy sending their younger sons and daughters into the church with no vocation. That also is an abuse, and it harmed both. But anyway, that's what they did. So the marriage took place on February 13th, 1177. And Princess Joan was crowned Queen Joan of Sicily in Palermo Cathedral. They had one son who died in infancy before King William II himself died on November 11th, 1189. An illegitimate cousin named Tancred of Lecce then kidnapped Queen Joan, threw her in a dungeon, and proclaimed himself king. He was more acceptable to many of the Norman aristocracy in Naples, Sicily, since he had de Hauteville blood, whereas she was English. Half English, half French, because she was a Plantagenet, half Plantagenet. This was the issue that distracted Richard the Lionheart from the Third Crusade. He engaged and defeated Tancred in battle and freed his sister, whom he used to form another political alliance by marrying her to yet another guy she never met, Raymond VI, the Count of Toulouse. But that marriage took place after the Third Crusade. By the time all this was resolved, by the time he had freed her and she was back in his camp, it was November of 1190. Logistically, an unsafe time of year to transport an army by sea. So they fortified in winter quarters remaining in Sicily. When spring arrived and preparations were well advanced to continue, Richard's mother, the Queen Dowager, Eleanor of Aquitaine, whom we met on the last crusade, arrived in Sicily with Richard's fiancée, whom he never met, in March of 1191. This lady was Berengaria of Navarre. So she's Spanish, a Spanish princess. They decided to postpone the wedding. Since they were on the way to the Holy Land, they figured, okay, we'll get married in the Holy Land. So she, Berengaria, as well as Richard's sister, Joan, joined the Third Crusade. So this Third Crusade, without the Germans, sailed from Sicily, Messina in Sicily, in spring of 1191. Philip II and the French contingent left in March, while Richard and the English contingent in April. The French made for Tyre and Lebanon and arrived without incident, whereas the English were caught in a storm off the coast of the island of Cyprus, which proved yet another distraction and delay. And we have an account of this from a participant, Geoffrey de Vinsauf. This is from his account, the Itinerarium Peregrinorum, the itinerary of the pilgrim. Oh, there's people. Okay, quote, shortly before sundown on the vigil of St. Mark the Evangelist, so that year, that would have been a Wednesday, April 24th, 1191. A black cloud darkened the sky. All at once, a blowing storm and high winds buffeted the turbulent waves of the sea and turned back the sailors. Even before the coming of the storm, King Richard's ships had been dispersed by the uneven winds and were making for Cyprus. These ships were thrown about by the waves during the storm, were blown back by the wind, and were dashed against some rocky crags. So many men were being thrown violently about by the wind that although the sailors tried to prevent it, 3 of the king's ships were shattered by the rushing waves, and some of the men in them were drowned. The natives of the place, meaning the island of Cyprus, pretended that their intentions were peaceful. They joyfully received those who escaped to land from the shipwreck. They comforted the shipwrecked men in their misfortune and brought them to a nearby castle to refresh themselves. When the survivors got there, however, they were deprived of all their weapons and placed in custody. This was done, it was said, lest if they were to go out armed, they might spy on the country or might even get into a fight. The Cypriot Greeks claimed that they could not do otherwise until they had ascertained the emperor's wishes. Okay, so this term emperor gets used a lot. So obviously this is not the Emperor Barbarossa, but nor is it the Byzantine emperor. So this guy was Isaac Doukas Komnenos. He was the 3rd son of the Byzantine Emperor John II, and he was a claimant to the Byzantine Empire, but he never ruled it because his claim was he was too far down in the line. But he claimed it. So that was, that's why they called him emperor. But in reality, he was actually just ruler of the island of Cyprus from 1184 to 1191. Nevertheless, contemporary sources did call him the Emperor of Cyprus because that's what he called himself. So the emperor, we'll just call him Doukas. Our chiefs, so this meaning leaders, kings and nobles back in Europe who had funded this, our chiefs pitied our shipwrecked men who were kept in confinement and sent them clothes and other necessary things. Stephen of Tumingham, the king's marshal and treasurer, sent them a great quantity of necessities, but in fact, everything sent to the prisoners was confiscated by the Cypriots and the keepers at the entrance of the castle where our men were confined. Meanwhile, the emperor ordered all the warriors of his kingdom to assemble and to gather together in a very strong army. On the day after his arrival, Thursday, May 22nd, 1191, the emperor, disguising his scheme with peaceful words, called upon the queens. Now he's referring to Richard's sister, the Queen Joan of Sicily, as well as his fiancée, Berengaria. Now, she's not the queen yet, but she would later marry Richard and become queen, so that's to come in safety. So so their ships did not wreck, so they just docked in Cyprus, but they were staying on the ships. So here, Doukas wants them, he's offering them hospitality. He said, don't come into the castle. So he alleged that they might count on him, that they would be at liberty in every particular, that there would be no molestation of their people, and that there would be no danger to fear. They declined to come, but again, the next day, the emperor, on the pretext of doing them honor, sent welcoming gifts to them, bread, goat meat, and the best wine of the Cypriot grapes, said to be unlike that of any other nation. On the 3rd day, a Sunday, he tried to get around the queens with blandishments and to lead them astray with his wiles. They were now in a difficult position and shifted from one alternative to another. They were worried lest if they yielded to the emperor's persuasions, then they would be made captive, which of course is exactly what had happened. While if they steadfastly refused to accede to him, they feared that he might do them violence, which was probably on the way. While they were conferring and speaking sadly with one another that Sunday, the lookouts all at once spied 2 ships bearing directly toward them, looking like wavering spikes among the frothy tips of the curling waves. While the queens and those with them were still arguing about this unverified news, they caught sight of still more ships following the first ones. There was no delay. The naval force was followed by a multitude of ships, and they were heading directly for the port. Discussing this royal fleet, they were jubilant with great glee, in proportion as they had previously been desperate and despairing. Now, indeed, after many unwelcome labors by God's providence, King Richard was brought to the island of Cyprus. On the Feast of St. John, before the Latin Gate, that's May 6th, King Richard and his whole army arrived in the port of Limassol. When the king learned of the hardships of his shipwrecked men, of the stealing from them, and about the other things which had meanwhile befallen them, he was deeply grieved, and ordered an attack. When our men had taken their galleys and landed their own boats, ballista and archers, emboldened by their first success, hurled torrents of javelins at those whom they saw trying to escape from the beach. Without delay, the Cypriots, who could not bear up under the brunt of our attack, gave up the sight and retreated to firmer ground. Both our ballista and theirs were using arrows and javelins continuously. The sky seemed clouded over by them, and the serenity of the day was darkened by the showers of javelins. The city boiled with the throng of men, and the whole area was occupied by a multitude of ballistari who were working persistently. Victory hung in the balance, and wavered as to which party it would favor. Then he, King Richard of the Lionheart, leapt first from his barge into the sea, and bravely set upon the Cypriots, sword waving. Our other men imitated his steadfast attitude. Henceforth they accompanied the king, and shot arrows at those who were resisting, in order to make the Cypriots take flight. As soon as our people rushed in, their mangled battle lines gave up. There could be seen in the flying rain of spears the Greeks, who had been overcome, fleeing. You could hear the sounds of the advancing men, the groans of the fallen, the cries of those who were retreating. When the Greeks had retreated, our men drove them back first to the town, and then from the town to the nearby camps on the plains. When the king was pursuing the fleeing emperor, acquired a mount, rushed immediately to the emperor and said, "My lord emperor, come and begin a single combat with me." The emperor made as if to obey, and then immediately fled. The king, Richard, then occupied the town of Limassol. He had the queens brought from Buza and lodged them in a villa. There, after many adventures and discomforts at sea, they refreshed themselves, quietly and securely. The king spent that night, May 7th and 8th, in his tents. The next day, about the 9th hour, the king advanced with his horses. He found some Greeks not far away. When the Greeks had seen them, our men ceased the pursuit and halted. The king charged swiftly at the enemy. He broke up the enemy's crowded battle line by charging through it. He dealt now with this group, now with that one, and in short order he dispersed them all. The emperor reflected on the courage of our men and the flight of his people. Then, when he saw he remained alone, he spurred his horse and speedily fled to the mountains. The people returned to the loot, and they made off with much booty, arms, valuable sick garments, and even the emperor's tents, together with all that was in them, including gold and silver vessels. The emperor's bed, with its choice appointments, and all his furnishings, his special helmets, breastplates, and swords. They also took a great deal of spoils and flocks, and herds of oxen, and cattle, goats and sheep, noble mares and colts, hogs and hens. They found both choice wines and a great quantity of food. They took captives from the army. Then he is skipping down. After the rest of Richard's fleet arrived in Cyprus, messengers went back and forth, arranging a meeting, an armistice meeting between the emperor and between Ducas and Richard. Okay, so picking up. However, the following night, the emperor fled swiftly, trusting in the darkness of night, and riding his best tawny horse. The emperor came down from Kentara with doleful mien and dejected countenance. He came up to the king and humbled himself at the king's feet. Kneeling, he declared that he would submit to the king's mercy in all things, that he would keep neither land nor castle for himself, but that for the rest the king should be his lord, so long as he did not cast him in iron chains. This took place on the Friday after the Feast of St. Augustine and before Pentecost, Friday, the 31st of May. Okay, now, all of this caused Richard and his bride-to-be, his fiancée Berengaria, to alter their plans. So rather than wait, because they're on an island, so they have to get back on the ship to go to the Holy Land. So rather than do that and wait to get married, they decided to get married there. So they married on May 12th, 1191, at Limassol on the island of Cyprus. And then Richard sent Joan, his sister, and Berengaria on to Acre in the Holy Land. Meanwhile, the French and the English cooperated coordinated their assault, their landing in the Holy Land. All right, so picking up with the account of Sir Geoffrey of Insaf, quote, so they won a battle. They won the Battle of Acre. Acre was under siege, so they lifted the siege of Acre, and that was on July 12th, 1191. So skipping down in Geoffrey's account, we pick up with the next month, August 1191. Sir Geoffrey wrote thusly, quote, Philip Rex, Philip II, the King of France, then considered his part in the crusade accomplished and began immediately preparing to return to the west. When things had thus been arranged, after the liberation of the city, meaning the city of Acre, toward the end of the month of July, a rumor circulated all at once through the army that the King of France, upon whom the people's hopes rested, wished to go home and earnestly desired to prepare for his journey. How shameful, how disgraceful it was for him to wish to leave while the task was still pending, unfinished, meaning the task of freeing Jerusalem. But what could be done about it? He left behind as his replacement in the Holy Land the Duke of Burgundy with many men. King Richard demanded that the French king take an oath to keep faith, and that he promise that he would not knowingly or maliciously trespass on King Richard's lands back in Europe, or the lands of his followers while Richard remained on crusade. The King of France took an oath and swore to King Richard that he would observe all these conditions. The French king gave as hostages the Duke of Burgundy and Count Henry, that's of Burgundy, and Henry Henry of Troyes, who was the Count of Champagne, and 5 or more others whose names are not known to me. How faithfully the French king stood by this agreement and oath is well known, well enough to everyone. For as soon as he re-entered his homeland, he stirred up the country and threw Normandy into disorder. What more? The King of France took leave and departed from the army at Acre. Instead of blessings, everyone had bad wishes and curses for him. On the feast of St. Peter in Chains, Thursday, the 1st of August, the year of our Lord, 1191, the King of France boarded a ship and sailed toward Tyre. So now Richard's alone. Richard continued the crusade. At the Battle of Arsuf on September 7th, 1191, he gave Saladin his first defeat. The first time that anybody, well, there were times Saladin's forces had been defeated, but this was the first time that Saladin leading troops on the battlefield was defeated. Now, it was a tactical defeat, not strategic, because Saladin was able to withdraw, still militarily effective. After this, Richard retook the city of Jaffa, or Joppa in the New Testament, from the Muslims for the Christians. And then Richard made it to Jerusalem. And this is the first time he had seen it. And once he saw it, this is an accomplished, experienced soldier and general, and he realized that the third of the Crusader army left to him simply could not hope to take it. It was too well fortified. He also learned from messengers that the feckless Philip, the French king, was conspiring back in France with John, Richard's younger brother, to divide up English possessions in France. So Richard had to return. For this reason, he opened negotiations with Saladin. To end the Third Crusade. So picking up the account. Safaddin, this is Saladin's brother. So Saladin and Richard, of course, they would not go to each other's camps initially because there was always the possibility they'd be kidnapped and held for ransom. So Saif ad-Din, Saladin's brother, was initially the one going back and forth before they finalized things. So Saif ad-Din carefully secured peace terms on these conditions: that Ascalon, which was an object of fear for Saladin's empire so long as it was standing, be destroyed, and that it be rebuilt by no one. Saladin allowed Joppa to be restored to the Christians. They were to occupy the city and its vicinity, including the seacoast and the mountains, freely and quietly. Saladin agreed to confirm an inviolate peace between Christians and Saracens, guaranteeing for both free passage and access to the Holy Sepulchre of the Lord, without the exaction of any tribute, and with the freedom of bringing objects for sale through any land whatsoever, and of exercising a free commerce. When these conditions of peace had been reduced to writing and read to him, King Richard agreed to observe them, for he could not hope for anything much better, especially since he was sick, relying upon scant support, and was not more than 2 miles from the enemy's station. Whoever contends that Richard should have felt otherwise about this peace agreement should know that he thereby marks himself as a perverse liar. Remember, this account is written by somebody who was there. So Geoffrey was there. Saladin replied through the appointed messengers that with his holy law and God Almighty as his witnesses, he thought King Richard so pleasant, so upright, so magnanimous, and so excellent, that if the land were to be lost in his time, he would rather have it taken into Richard's power than to have it go into the hands of any other prince whom he had ever seen. So Richard departed the Holy Land in October of 1191, with little accomplished, considering that he never lost a battle in the Holy Land, and he was the only general, either Christian or Muslim, to ever defeat Saladin in the field. The 174th Pope, Clement III, died 5 months earlier. Of course, they didn't know that yet. Richard didn't know that yet. And it really materially would have made no difference to his decision. But Pope Clement died on March 20th, 1191. 10 days after the death of Clement III, the Cardinal Deacon of Santa Maria in Cosmedine accepted election as Pope 175, taking the name Pope Celestine III. Born in Rome in 1106, baptized Giacinto Bobone, he was a member of the powerful House of Orsini, who was given to the church, a younger son given to the church, served in diplomatic capacities on 2 legatine missions to Spain. As Pope, his most enduring contribution was in the approval of a new military religious order. I mentioned them earlier, and then I remembered that this is the chronological time to cover it. In 1192, officially the Order of the Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, but more conventionally known as the Teutonic Knights, wearing a white habit with a black cross. Its origin can be traced back 49 years earlier, to 1143, when Pope Celestine II ordered a military community we've already met, the Knights Hospitaller of St. John, to open an institution to serve German pilgrims who did not speak the local languages in the Holy Land, nor did they speak Latin. Since the Hospitallers at the time were mostly French, they had to recruit and train German members in order to fulfill the Pope's command, which they did, and then opened the Domus Teutonicorum, meaning the House of the Germans. They opened it in the Holy Land, attached to a church dedicated to the Blessed Mother, which then became called St. Mary of the Germans. And she is still the patroness of the order, the Teutonic Knights. They still exist. I mean, obviously it's not a military order anymore, but they still exist like the Knights Hospitaller do. In their early days, the Teutonic Knights, the brothers were called the Mariani in her honor, the Brothers of Mary. After the loss of Jerusalem in 1187, they militarized. So initially, they were a hospital order, like the Knights Hospitaller of St. John, who initially recruited and trained them. They were first just a Hospitaller order. But then after Jerusalem fell, out of necessity for self-defense, then they militarized, just as the Knights of St. John had done. It was this new synthesis of military with hospitaller Teutonic Knights that Pope Celestine III recognized in 1192, placing them under the Augustinian rule, which was loose enough for them to accommodate both of their vocations while still living as a religious community. After the fall of the Holy Land in the next century, they focused on warfare against pagans in Eastern Europe. And as we shall see in the next century and the century after, although not really, that'll be the next, anyway, that had a profound influence on the history of Germany, especially in the north, such that the German military decoration, the Iron Cross, was shaped as the Teutonic, the cross of the Teutonic Knights, which is the Maltese cross, because of their heritage, their foundation by the Knights of St. John. So it was shaped like the Hospitaller Maltese cross, but the Hospitaller order had a black habit with a white Maltese cross. The Teutonic Knights had a white habit with a black Maltese cross. Pope Celestine III died on January 8th, 1198, at the age of 85. His successor's reign is going to take us into the next century. So we'll stop here, and then the next step in the series will go into the 13th century, the 1200s. So for the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.